How do rankings get made? You were talking to two guys, Chad Parsons, Jordan McNamara, who make Dynasty rankings. A lot goes into that. It is more than just how would you rank a player for the given year? How old are they? Pedigree. So much goes into this cocktail. We're going to break it down tonight as well as other topics. Welcome to the Footballguys Dynasty Show. And Jordan, you are making rankings for Footballguys. I have made rankings. What goes into this equation for you? There's a number of different processi that we have. But as you were going on that venture, specifically as you are pulled on as full-time staff here at Footballguys as a staff writer and now staff ranker, break down a little bit of that process, maybe overarching in the macro sense, and we can kind of dive into it a little more by position if there's variance there. But it's a big, arduous, and honestly thankless process a lot of times, because people go, well, let me see the rankings, and all the articles in the world can be great, but it really distills down to where do you have someone ranked and why.
Yeah, and I'd actually be really interested to see what you have to say about this, because the difference between being in season versus being dynasty rankings it's a big difference in terms of some of the things you have to look at. So I'd be really interested in your take on this. But I will say this is my first year doing it, and I've always had sort of going back years now, I've had basically a probably more of a tiered process, but this is the first time I've had to go 1 through 75 at running back or whatnot. So for me, I think the easiest way is to think about it. There is a tier break in terms of rankings, in terms of some of the stuff that I look at. So, I'll just use running back, for example. I think it's a good proxy for running backs. You can look at it, and I think that there's a tier of players, whether that's 15, 20 deep. I think it'd probably depend on how you measure it, that you're going to feel pretty comfortable with in 2021, almost regardless of what happens in 2020. So, you're looking at guys that are on, early in rookie deals. You're looking at guys that are on long-term contracts. McCaffrey and those sorts, obviously, but you're looking at guys like Jonathan Taylor, where I think this year, if we get production, it's really nice. If we don't, I still think he's going to be, I think 2021 is a fully insulated year for him. So I do think you have that. And then after that, it becomes, is a little bit different of a conversation for me. And then sort of how do you treat the guys? I think a lot at that point is year to year, right? There's not a ton of difference in terms of, maybe age and production profiles and health, maybe even between a guy like, for example, Leonard Fournette and Todd Gurley, right? They're both in a flux in terms of, are they going to sign long-term deals? Are they going to not sign long-term deals? Is this more of a one year to year thing, or are they going to go to a different team and be a committee back, right? There's a lot of that in there. So I think that naturally develops a tier, and then you think about those guys. And that's sort of how I look at it. And then once you sort of get past those guys, that's really where it gets interesting, because then it's really a reflection of what your value system is. So you can get into the 30s and 40s of the positions and be well beyond. And I think see some really interesting divergence, right? You might, for example, someone might value Nyheim Hines highly because they think that he's an interesting, he could be a weak fill-in or whatever because he's a PPR guy, or, the Phillip Rivers connection, for example, something I saw today. On the flip side, I would value a guy like Latavius Murray substantially higher than a guy like Nyheim Hines, just because that's sort of the profile that I'm looking for in terms of usability. So I think those things are pretty interesting. I don't think there's a ton of difference up at the top. There's differences in terms of rankings, but I think really where you'll see massive philosophical differences could be later on down the board.
Yeah, and that's based on are you valuing the churn, let's say, of knowing that, I'm not going to have a lot of my running backs on the back end of my roster, say next year, versus so a person that's really chasing who's an injury away now, who could be a contributor, maybe an Adrian Peterson type of how much will he move the needle this year versus let me take a developmental talent, and that may be someone who's a taxi squad guy, maybe someone who's running back 3 on a depth chart, but yet there's not really a clear path to them producing this year. And especially if you don't have strong pedigree behind that. But like you said, I think in Dynasty, you're probably going to get a really high consensus. I was just looking at the Footballguys rankings, and I mean, the top 20 to 25, there's, 22 to 23 of the same names on everybody's list. So there's not, and those are projected starters or soon to be starters or likely starters, of relative import, around the NFL that, you kind of rank them based on that. And then beyond that, maybe you sneak 1 or 2 in there that other people don't have. But I like what you said in the beginning, which to me, tiers are always more instructive than the straight 1 through X, because where's the break? Some people might have a break after running back 3. Some people might have a break after running back 6. Some people might have a break after running back 1. And then the next break is running back 14. So I think that to me has always been more influential in terms of how it's presented, because just 1 through 60, it's be like, wow, I can't believe you have this guy 7 spots behind this other running back, whereas you could view them in the same tier and someone else could be 2 tiers apart, and those say drastically different things from a macro and story perspective on those 2 players. Because if you look at rankings, it's always, well, if they're 2 tiers apart, I mean, you're going to need to pay for that, if you were trading down 2 tiers, whereas you might even take a 2nd round pick if you were moving within the same tier, depending on where that is at a position. So that's those are all the intricacies. And so let me ask you this, because you're new to rankings and putting the actual the proverbial pen to paper on that. So life before rankings, and Katie, a friend of ours, Katie Flower, is the same way, where again, excellent Dynasty owner, but you don't have to do rankings to be a good Dynasty player. So discuss the process of, now that you're doing rankings, kind of what did you learn from that process that kind of is just a different way of how you look at things by having to go through that process, as opposed to, well, I'm managing my team, so I have a sense of how I like players stacked up with each other, but you really look at that through a drafting lens or a trading lens, not so much as, well, this guy's at 46 and this guy at 60 arbitrarily.
Yeah, so that's really the interesting part, is that's what are you aiming for? And we were discussing this in a Footballguys, or I wasn't specifically involved, but we were privy to it in a Footballguys staff chat today, discussing basically the philosophy of rankings and what are you trying to do. So that's really interesting. Like when you're trying to say, what do you want your rankings to reflect? Are you trying to maximize at the high end? Are you trying to minimize your losses? Are you trying to, what's your aim, right? What are you measuring in terms of grading them?
And Dynasty has a lot more ingredients to that soup than redraft as well. Because redraft, you're trying to rank them, and frankly, I mean, half your roster, it's like, well, what are they going to do in the first 8 weeks of the season? Because you're probably moving and shaking and moving on from that if something hasn't transpired, because it's the sprint. And Dynasty, it's a lot more like, that's what I always find interesting about evaluating trades, where it's like, you can say, oh man, 3 months ago I made this trade and boy, it looks horrible. But yet that same trade can whiplash around, and it can be 18 months beyond that first checkpoint that you evaluated, and you go, wow, now it looks great. Now it flips on its end. I lost it, now I won it. So it's a very ambiguous based on the time stamp, on rankings as well.
Yeah, totally. And on top of that, beyond just the beyond just the who scores in Dynasty of value over time, right? Where in redraft, you don't, I mean, who cares what a player's worth in 6 to 12 weeks, right?
What's their 2021 ADP? Oh, I won that one last year.
Right. Right. So those are big things. And for me in the tier, what's I think the most difficult part of it is in the tiering process that we were talking about, right? I have sort of buckets of players that I'll put people in and just use running backs an easy proxy for me because I think we speak a lot of the same language on running backs. But I'll think of running backs in like a bell cow sense, and then I'll think of like someone that's in a committee but is in the lead back version of the committee. So someone, I don't know, if you were to think like Melvin Gordon would be the lead back, but Philip Lindsay's sort of an ancillary piece, something like that. And then you get one that's more of a 50-50 type, and so you're putting guys in sort of role buckets, right? But then it sort of gets interesting because you get those guys that are in 50-50 committees, and then you sort of go into guys that are one injury away. And to me, like that's pretty interesting. Like that value is pretty good, but they don't match up entirely, right? Like the worst one of those guys might not be as good as a committee back. And so it's interesting. You're really sort of taking these profiles and these preferences that you have and trying to sort of smooth them out. Again, for me, I think think a lot.
And it could be team direction. Team situation specific, yeah. Right? Because totally. I was just looking. Here's one example, and this may be spot on for what you're talking about, or a little bit off. Let me know. But like you have Chris Carson. I was just glancing through while you're talking about you sort of have them in buckets, and Chris Carson is probably, just glancing at this, your lowest or one of your lowest true projected week one starter types in the NFL. Mm-hmm. Outside of, we don't know what's going to happen here, like Miami or a few of those. Mm-hmm. But Chris Carson, but yet really close to that. And heck, if you were doing tiers, it may be the same tier. You got someone like Alexander Mattison, who is at this point in time a clear backup. But I'm sure that talk of, well, what happens if Dalvin Cook is not playing in a specific week? I would imagine if you're doing projections for that week, you'd probably have Alexander Mattison higher. So you say that the potential is higher, and obviously you have an age difference and a pedigree difference and a lot of other things that go into that. But that's just one example of how they can be close, and yet current state of where they are on a depth chart can vary.
Yeah, totally. And I didn't pull up my I didn't pull up my running back rankings, but I would guess that Dylan's not far behind there, right? So
your priority guys that currently aren't starters, and that can probably change. If Aaron Jones had a season-ending injury, I'm sure you would say, well, now that's cleared up, and right. And now I feel a lot differently about Dylan, but it may last the whole year, and that's part of the dynasty scope of value and what we project forward.
Right. He'd be a top 15, 16 back, right? That's where he would end up being. So I do think it's tough to, on a specific, right? It's tough to put a number because they each reflect a different profile and a different risk. And that's really the tough part about rankings. And what I would say to people is like, if you're just looking at rankings, think about the decision, right? Use it as a guide, but think about the decision that you're making and whether that reflects the strategy that you want to implement, right? So for me, I would rather embrace higher variance at running back because, like Latavius Murray last year, in the 2 weeks that Kamara was out, running back 1 outscored running back 2 by 10 points on a better pace in terms of wins over replacement than McCaffrey was last year, right? Those are, that's like injecting my veins with wins, right? That's exactly, that's, give me all of that. Doing that, and you do that a couple times a year, right? And the numbers would say that's a pretty common occurrence. Maybe not necessarily the running back 1 aspect of the Latavius Murray, but the multi-week fill-in starter. And something that you and I have talked about, right? When you're thinking about whether it's a flex or a running back 2 situation, right? For each one of those, you're looking to fill in 13 weeks, right? In the regular season. That's what you're looking to do. And sort of how do you do that? And you can do it in different ways. Well, part of the problem with rankings is I sort of value those guys really high. And so when I rank them, right, that's how I rank them there. But if you don't, right, if you sort of look at it different, or you have different value systems, right, you might see the number, but that might not match up with your values and your beliefs on player value and player production and team building. So it is a reflection of my process. And a lot of it incorporates too, especially up at the top. I use base rates, which is basically for guys that haven't done it yet. What is their draft
likelihood of doing it.
Right. Yeah. But it's just simply stripping away their name, using their draft pedigree and their amount of time they've been in the NFL. And the position, we're talking about running backs, you just use that. I have basically a grid, and it tells me the odds that they hit for a top 24 season. That's really instructive, right? That's really instructive. Once they hit, that moves into a different category for me. It's something I call density. That is basically once they hit, how dense is their hit, right? And so I can tell sort of historically how running backs have done, or any position really, how they've done. And I use that right as a number for once guys have hit. So I use that really as a starting point. And then I say, okay, like here's what the historical comps would say in a general
like art
sense.
and science. I mean, what you're talking about right now is the science. And then obviously when you get them relatively close, you're probably going to use some factor of they're close, but I have to put one ahead of another. And that's sort of the artistry and probably the who would I actually take in, like, let me put that in a situation, or who would I trade straight up and prefer, things like that probably.
Yeah, totally. I those are great sort of
tiebreakers or tier delineators.
Right. Yeah. And you think about those, and I've done those trades, and I'm sure you have done too in your rankings, where you get offered something and you're like, oh yeah, I want this side of it. And then you look at your rankings and be like, wow, I need,
and it's the reverse. And you're like, yeah, I got to change that.
I got to fix that one up. So
fix that ASAP. Let me ask you this, because this to me, if you were making different rankings, that if you were making a startup, if someone asked you, Jordan, do you have a cheat sheet? But even if it wasn't overall, but even by position, it would look different for a startup draft than how you would value players or recommend them in various settings, contending, rebuilding. I mean, that's the nuance. Redraft doesn't really have that so much. And Dynasty, it feels like if you want to cover your bases, you've got to have almost 3-4 different types of rankings, because those last players you might rank, we talk about, going 75 deep, 100 deep at a position or something like that. But yet when you get that deep on an existing team roster, it might be, well, this is the last pick of my startup draft. Who should I pick? Or, I'm looking to make this trade. Would you trade X pick or X player for X player? Well, it's like, well, how deep is your roster? Like, there's so many qualifiers I find. And that's what the art, and honestly, that's what I love about Dynasty, is that there's a lot more of, well, it depends answers, and how things can change over time, or just with your team direction and where you are in the moment with your roster, that make it, well, okay, then, I would prefer it this way, where your stock answer might be the other way.
Yeah, and I think one of the concepts that I've thought about is 2-2-2, right? How do your decisions affect you in 2 weeks, 2 months, and 2 years, right? And those are different, right? Those are vastly different timeframes. It doesn't seem like that much of a difference in Dynasty. It's a big deal in terms of those timeframes in Dynasty. So thinking about the immediacy of now versus 2 years from now, a guy like Julio Jones, right? I mean, I've comped him to my jalopy of a 97 Grand Am multiple times, and I always use that example. He's much more attractive than my college beat up car was, but the value on him is never going to go up, right? It then becomes a question of,
what is he worth to you?
What do you who cares, right? To me, that the question is do I care? I don't, right? That's not why I play Dynasty. I have in times past played to have super high valuable rosters. Now I play to win, right? And I think that those two things, right? The whole, how does your roster look in the summer? Those debates are nice, but I find that those rosters are typically not practical in season. So for me, if I'm sort of in the ballpark, he's been a player that I've contended for. That might look different in a startup draft, right? I mean, we had a situation a couple years ago.
That's why he's not going in the first round. He's hyper productive, but because of his age and because you can't really, like you said, the 2-2-2, looking out 2 years with Julio Jones is different than a 21-year-old running back. It just does.
Right. And a couple years ago, I had this decision. You and I were talking about it. I was on the clock with Julio or Devontae Adams. And I ultimately went with Devontae Adams just because I said I have more, it gives me more options, right?
A runway. You have a longer runway.
And I've got multiple, right? I'm going down a hallway. I've got a lot of doors, right? That I can sort of figure out ways out of. With Julio, it's a dwindling number, right? It's not that many doors in that hallway. So, that's the thing. And, for a guy, for example, like right now, he might go a little bit later, but you might have more optionality going into the future with a guy like Allen Robinson than you do with Julio Jones. Again, it matters how you feel about those players, right? So I wouldn't use rankings as much. If I were a consumer of rankings, and I am, if I'm a consumer, and I think in season this isn't particularly true, but Dynasty as well, I'm sort of looking for relativeness, and then I want to see sort of what that if that relative difference, if that reflects sort of the decision making that I need, the outcome that I need, right? Do I need someone that's more high variance, right? Do I need someone that's safer, right? All of those things, I think you sort of look at them in a relative sense, get an idea of where guys are ranked as a consumer, and then sort of look and move from there based on about where the rankings would be.
Yeah, and I wanted to, let me see, there was one thing while you were talking that was, so Julio Jones is that classic example of existing league, contending team, that has a way greater value on your roster. Set the lineup, set it and forget it, auto start player. And you kind of say, we mentioned that, I think I've mentioned this before, where it's like if you make a trade in Superflex a couple years ago when Drew Brees was losing his value, that was the case in one of my leagues, where it's like, and now you're just printing money. Every year he plays is like free money there.
Right.
Julio Jones in an existing league, we've seen sell lows on him. And why? That's a team retooling. That's a team looking at age and saying, I don't care if he puts up 20 points per game this year. That doesn't really help me. I need to get something younger, something that is more of that last two, which is the 2-year spectrum, right, or even 4-year or whatever, just resetting the clock. And like you said, a depreciating asset jalopy, but that jalopy can get you where you want to go. And so that's why a startup draft, like you said, you had some pause there, even though he's coming at a discount at a certain point with Julio Jones, especially this offseason. But you say, initial team build, you kind of need to, you can play to contend, but you also, if you have, it's interesting, the mix between guys like Julio Jones, where you can mix that in to a start. Julio Jones. So we'll see how that. In an existing league, you say that's really valuable, and then a rebuilding team, you're willing to sell off Julio Jones probably for a late first. If you think you might contend, you start out 0-3 this year, you might be running for the exit. For a fraction of what the startup value is, or what a contending team would value that. And then that's why you almost have, I remember I used to do contending, rebuilding, and then sort of neutral dynamics. And again, labor of love. It takes a long time to tier and reevaluate and assess these player values in a number of fronts. I wanted to ask you about one player specifically on your quarterback ranking. So we didn't talk about quarterback much at all, but dive into this because there's so much to unpack here with one player. And I'm going to say Josh Allen because number one, for people that don't know, you are very close to the Buffalo Bills situation. So close that you can't throw to the stadium, right? But they are very close. They're close enough.
I could ride my bike there. It would take me a long time, but
they're your hometown team.
Take a couple days, but yeah.
If they're, yeah. And so you have them at QB 8, and that is aggressive. And we think, again, very similarly about quarterbacks. So this could be a tier situation, but in terms of what he's done so far, do you have questions about the passer development, which we've seen guys like Cam Newton, go a long way in their career, produce a lot of things without really developing to a high level as a passer. So just talk through Josh Allen, ranking him between, that team intimately, and probably more intimately than any other NFL team from just the annual and weekly machinations there, but then also a tightly compacted and contested quarterback ranking hierarchy right now where, he falls below. We know, you're a huge Dak Prescott fan, Deshaun Watson for what they've done. So you've got him behind, 3, 4, 5 obvious guys. And so you have Josh Allen pretty high up of the rest, the best of the rest. So kind of talk through that.
Josh Allen's probably the most difficult rank in the entire thing. And again, that's something I think that warrants discussion too. Is it that not all guys are the same? in terms of your rankings. He's a very difficult rank for me, very difficult. And he's someone that I have come absolutely 100% full circle on, right? You and I spent an off season a couple of years ago, 6 months of it just banging the drum against Josh Allen as a top 10 pick, right? Just we didn't like the profile. Then at the price, then the price creators threw the floor, and I'm like, all right, like late second round rookie pick and startup in a super flex draft, 4th round rookie pick and start one, like you have to be in at that cost. Everyone dumps on him for saying he can't throw, right? He's inaccurate, all of these things. It's actually not true. It's 100% not true. What is actually true is that Josh Allen struggles at the extremes. So Josh Allen in short throwing situations performs below average. On long throws, even though he's got a cannon for an arm, it's a finely untuned cannon, right? It does not particularly accurate. But in the 5 to 15 range, right, in where the money's made, he's above average, completion percentage above expectation. So when you sort of look at it and break it down, I think he has shown a lot of development. He's not inside my line of being what I would consider a sure thing based on my, what I look for in terms of quarterback success, but he's basically on the next rung of it. How the question is I sort of look at it and we can debate whether Carson Wentz is good or not. That's probably a conversation for a different show, but I put him after Carson Wentz because Carson Wentz has got the tier breaker, my default in terms of grading quarterbacks. He's accomplished it. Then Allen falls into a tier of the older quarterbacks and the guys that I don't think have the same amount of upside, right? That could be Matt Ryan and Aaron Rodgers and Jared Goff and Matt Stafford and Cousins, right? Who I actually have above Burrow and Mayfield. That's an interesting thing because if I sort of put Allen there, I'm probably not going to get him because I'm just going to wait, right? And that's the interesting part about rankings is it doesn't really reflect what my draft plan is. My draft plan is going to be like, all right, like I'm really high on Matt Ryan versus the market. So I'm going to probably be more on him or Rodgers, right? So that's really how I think about it. I mean, they're more in a tier for me. I do think that Josh Allen has very high upside, right? I don't think 35, 40 touchdowns is an unreasonable number in terms of total touchdowns, right?
Well, we saw Cam Newton do that,
Right,
he had that
right.
magical year they go to the Super Bowl. I think he had 35 touchdowns, but when you put that with the rushing and Allen's the same way, right? I mean, you see what he's done 2 straight years. I actually did a double take because I didn't know this offhand. He's got 8 and 9 touchdowns rushing respectively each of his first 2 seasons.
Absolutely.
I mean, that is like Cam Newton. That's like
noting.
Cam Newton touchdown peaks. I mean, he's had ups and downs. I mean, Cam Newton had a little more yardage wise, I believe, at his career peak. But so you have that at least to buoy, the ups and downs and rocky road or whatever of however he progresses over the next 2-3 years as a passer. I thought it was interesting though, because looking at some comps over what he's done so far through 2 seasons, a lot of them, if they take a step forward to be an upper half QB1, this is really the year they do it. Mm-hmm. So I guess one of my closing questions on Josh Allen was going to be, do you think this is a big year for him, considering that, you've got John Brown, which is arguably the biggest thing he had last year. And now you add Stephon Diggs, you have Dawson Knox in year 2. Devin Singletary is entering year 2. Does it feel like this is a year you need to see that step? And then if not, you might soften your potential to take the next step sort of part of the ranking system.
Hey, when you say he only had John Brown last year, he had a damn good wide receiver 1.
Oh, I know.
That's my man. No, it's one thing I'll say about quarterback is you don't have long, right? Like even
he's year 3 of a rookie deal. Yeah.
Yeah. Like he's checked the box in terms of hitting for a top 12 season. That puts you into a whole different strata. But even then, the guys that do that, only 50% of them do it again, right?
Right.
So you don't get a ton of.
He's not there yet. is the thing.
He's not there yet, and one season doesn't make a hit. I'll say for him, I think I've seen growth. I think he's a leader, and that you don't get fantasy points for that, but I think you do get the benefit of the doubt in terms of contract stability and those sorts of things with those things. So all of that is, I think ultimately when push comes to shove, I think I think he puts up a top 12 season this year. And I think he's got pretty high upside because I think he can run in double-digit touchdowns. And now he's got a full a bevy of weapons they've continued to add. Like, they've done a really good job of building around him. And no one respects Cole Beasley or John Brown for what they should. But now they've got a legit wide receiver one in Stephon Diggs, and put John Brown, who he's one of my favorite players in the NFL. He's just a bad man. He, in a good way, they put him in his more natural wide receiver 2 spot. That's a really good, and Cole Beasley. It's tough to overstate how much Cole Beasley helped Josh Allen last year in terms of dependability, in terms of helping him grow in that short range, getting open for him, creating easy throws. He really helped him. So I do think that they have a really interesting core of guys, and I think Dawson Knox can help. He adds a lot of versatility in terms of what they can offer. He can do a lot of different things. So I'm excited about it. But I'll say I think Josh Allen can put in a top 12, and I think that could be top 5 type finish as well, because I think he's got the touchdown upside, because I think he can pound in double-digit touchdowns.
Yeah, but we know with rushing touchdowns, especially for quarterbacks, it varies. Results may vary, and I just wonder if he only scores 3 times on the ground. I mean, how does he look? How does he stack up finish wise? Because right now that's the basis point. And you're saying about Cole, and I was thinking back to when the Cowboys had Jason Witten a few years ago, plus Cole Beasley. I mean, third downs, you had both of those guys kind of running option routes, and it was just too easy with other weapons as well. But it was like, I mean, those two over the middle, or Beasley out of the slot. I mean, super underrated in his career. Want to remind
Jason
folks,
Witten pushing off and Cole Beasley creating separation.
Exactly, and Cole Beasley not pushing off.
Right.
This is Chad Parsons, Jordan McNamara, episode 18 of the Football Guys Dynasty Show. Want to remind you to subscribe, rate, and review on all of your podcasting platforms. Sign up with that Football Guys daily email update, which is footballguys.com/free. You don't want to go many hours without getting the news delivered from Joe Bryant to your inbox. And also, we still have the $3 million in total prizes over at the Football Guys Players Championship. Drafts going on every day, and this is draft season, the last couple weeks or so. You get redrafters into the fold, but you also have the Players Championship. Huge high stakes. You save $50 by signing up for 3 teams. myffpc.com/footballguys. I have a few other players listed, but let's talk some dynasty trades here in the last section of the show. And some of these are deeper leagues as well as some big, massive ones. I wanted to ask, because Terry McLaurin is in the news. And it seems like if you're not all in, you're kind of all out. And it reminded me of that when you were talking about your rankings, because basically if you rank a guy below a certain point, it just means you won't have him anywhere. And kind of your recommendation to the viewer is that you won't have him. Even if you're just a tick below, and especially if you have any sort of heat on them in a draft or a trade setting, you're just not going to have them. And this one is Amari in FFPC. So we're already recalibrating to shallow rosters. We've got Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup, teammates towards, and that was for Terry McLaurin and a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd next year.
Cooper, not close.
I mean,
not close.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people. I think this was in the Football Guys Dynasty Trades thread, and a lot of people are on the McLaurin side. So, can you talk through a little bit about how Cooper, where he is in his career, and McLaurin has had a quality start, a promising start to his career, but that does not make a career per se.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number on Amari Cooper, it's at least 3, if not 4, top 24 seasons to date. The number of guys that do that is not that high, right? So when you sort of put him in and recalibrate where he is, again, we talked about base rates and density earlier, right? That's what that measures. And the guys that sort of get to that strata, it's not a lot of people, and we take it for granted. And you get, he's coming off a wide receiver 10 season last year, and he was actually hurt, right? And there was some weird situations where he was basically used as a decoy last year. If he sits those games on a per game basis, where he's essentially, I mean, there were a couple of games in there where he was essentially game planned as a decoy, right? And so if I don't do this because you have to adjust for other people and we don't truly know, but when you sort of think about it and take those games out, to give you an idea of what he actually did when he was healthy, right, it bumps him up even more. So in McLaurin, good, right, but again, lesser profile, and was wide receiver 29 last year. That's behind Gallup, right? So if you put Gallup and McLaurin on the same, Gallup is further ahead than McLaurin is to date. Now, what would you say that going forward? I mean, I think Gallup's in a really interesting spot that he actually benefits from COVID, right? Because they bring in a guy, and we'll see what the offense looks like. I think it could be a 3 wide receiver funnel type situation plus Zeke.
There's no probably minimal tight end presence,
right,
even if you like Blake Jarwin as a stash or whatever. I mean, but it could funnel through the 3 high pedigree guys there.
Yeah, you basically see 85% of the targets go through the 3 wide receivers and the running backs, right?
And we have seen this before. I'd have to look up historical examples, but we've seen it before where you have 3 guys in the top 25 or 30.
Right.
On one offense. I think it was actually a Dallas iteration. If I think back, it was Miles Austin, Des Bryant, and somebody else. With one example, but yeah, I mean, they can all survive. Gallup is one, like, people are really underrating what he did, and people just could not wait to press their thumb down and say, you are now near valueless. We don't like you, when they took CeeDee Lamb, who frankly, Dallas probably didn't think he was going to be there.
Right.
That's the whole thing. BPA. Right. And I love those type of picks. They go, you know what? We were planning on something else, but we got this guy staring us. We'll take it.
Yeah. And
so I think it's interesting. There's no way if draft CeeDee Lamb, I don't think this trade gets done as it's currently constructed, because Gallup would be worth a first round pick in this trade construction.
Right. Yeah. So I'm on the Cooper side. Again, this is a guy that has done it versus a guy who, to me, hasn't checked the box yet. Now, guys that do hit day 2 guys that go for a wide receiver 3 finish, so basically a 25 through 36 finish, 100% of them have hit. So you would expect going forward, right, that the sample size isn't enormous, but the priors on that have been pretty good. So, but I think when you look at Cooper, that's just a whole different level, right? He's and for his age to have what he's done, it's very good. And he's almost getting to the point where it's like, where he's like Mike Evans. People just say there's no like sex appeal to it, right? Like, it's just, he's very consistent with what you get year over year. And people are worried about things like in-season consistency, which that's
exactly totally where I was going to go. That Cooper he's one of those players that I believe, for those that don't want variance, they literally want their wide receiver who scores 18 points per game to score 18 points per game, and that's what they would prefer throughout their entire season. Right. But they would prefer that, or I guess the Jarvis Landry theory, right? Because he's a more lower spread type of player, if memory serves, looking at his game logs and stuff. But Cooper, I mean, wouldn't you rather, and again, we're in the right on, this is rhetorical, but Cooper has these massive games, and massive games move the needle. They win the week for you. And other ones, you can just shoulder shrug and be like, he's part of my lineup and part of what I'm doing. But that doesn't hurt you as much as he can go off for 200 yards and multiple touchdowns and all these things that, frankly, a lot of wide receivers, especially predictable ones in your lineup, don't do very much at all. So that would be another interesting part of looking at it, that what he's done, but also just the upside factor where you said, and it wouldn't surprise either one of us if the Cowboys are that darling and go-to offense, because they basically were last year, and you could say that they're better this year. So, I mean, if he is the 1A on the most high-flying offense and Dak Prescott is going to take a step forward, I mean, Amari Cooper could be in for his best season yet. And you mentioned Mike Evans. I mean, the real difference there is Evans has been a higher ceiling guy, on an annual basis. So that means more big games and all those things, that Cooper has just been that shade below, but also underrated at this point in time. Here's a player we haven't talked about for a while, and I know we actually own him in our co-owned Dynasty league. We're in a couple together, a 16-team league, so that's going to create some complexity here. So Raheem Mostert, so he is in that Damian Williams type zone, right? Of not a ton of competition added, and he could be someone where you say, I tried to sell him, but if I'm not able to get what I want, he's a high variance guy for this year on the upside spectrum for 201. So 17 overall in this 16 teamer. Not super flex or anything fancy there. What are your thoughts on resetting Mostert for 201? I know your Spidey senses historically are probably different than maybe the utility for this year.
Yeah, well, I think 201, the question is A.J. Dillon available? And if he's not, is Antonio Gibson available, right? If those guys are gone, right, let's just assume that because it's 17 overall, I think there's a reasonable chance that both those guys are gone. I don't have a problem with it.
I would think in 16 team, I'll just say infuse this in a 12 teamer at 16 overall. Burrow and Tua are probably available, both of them. But in a 16 teamer, I think Burrow goes ahead of that line, and Tua might, because there's a lot more demand for quarterbacks. So that might help. That might help your cause that Gibson or Dillon is there. But.
Right. So yeah, that's
that's your line typically, Gibson or so.
Yeah, and I think there you can make arguments for wide receivers in that range. Ayuk had some buzz, now he's hurt. Don't career advice for a second. Don't be a San Francisco wide receiver because it's not going well this offseason. It's a lot of bad things happening. So
do you have a voodoo doll about Kendrick Bourne now? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, save yourself. Kendrick Bourne, Trent Taylor, put him on ice.
Dante Pettis, you might want to wait till 2021 for your massive career turning around breakout.
Yeah, Dante Pettis. He's got to be motivated.
What if Pettis is a week one thing? God, that would be funny.
Oh, man. Can you imagine? I'm not sure I could handle the motivational tweets. So I would say I think it's fine there. I had a situation where I can't remember if he was available in that range in the later second, or I was in a startup draft and it was measuring against the late second guys. And I'd said, I think for this year, I think he's got a good shot this year. I'm not sure he's going to be the clear starter. I think they might keep that Tevin Coleman in name only type of
first carry of every game.
Yeah, first. It's kind of like you see when Andrew Bogut for the Golden State Warriors a few years ago would play the first 5 minutes and then
he's
they'd
a
go
starter,
small ball.
and he played 9 minutes total. Yeah,
right. Yeah, and then go small ball for the last 36 minutes of the game, and he got
Andre Iguodala is playing the de facto center role for them in the third and fourth quarter.
Right. So that's kind of what we saw at times. So I do think that assuming that he's healthy, I think he's their most valuable running back. And we've seen what running backs can do in that scheme. It hasn't been long.
Do you think this year is going to be tougher for him to have those? We always talk about predictable starts. Is he going to be someone where you say he's a wild card flex type option, and you need to be okay with that? He could go for 150 yards and multiple touchdowns. And if they end up going with the quote unquote hot hand in a different direction this week, so be it. Is that the prism you need to think of him? Or do you think we actually might have more week to week, Mostert touches, role in the offense? Because we didn't have that a ton last year, just going through the waves of the in season.
And we might see that. Right, we didn't get him early, right? It was more late that he came on. So, here's what I would say. I think if him and Coleman are both going to play in a week, Jerick McKinnon's the wild card in all this. But listen, I'll believe that when I see it, and I hope he comes back. I hope he's healthy. But we don't really have
multiple years, and we still haven't in Jerick McKinnon's lifetime. There was a partial one season, and he was like the ancillary guy doing things on small volume. That's the only time we've really seen anything.
Right. And it was like him and Matt Asiata at a point, right?
You're reversing the order of what their priority of that backfield was. It was Matt Asiata's show. And that became a tagline for me, because it's like, you know what? He didn't beat that guy out for touches, and that guy's a out of work fullback.
Yeah. He pounded out 2.9 yards per carry. It was something. So I think my best guess on this would be I think that he's the most valuable player in their offense, right? So any week that he's healthy, right, especially early on, I'd be hard pressed. It would have to be a really minimal roster, or I'd have to be really good at every other position. I mean, he would feel to me like if it would be a pretty easy, if you're starting two and there's a flex, starting two running backs and there's a flex, he's probably in lineups.
Flex to start, yeah.
Yeah, but again, that's the same reason why you're not paying 108 for him, right? Like, because that's sort of the range in which he exists. Whereas a guy, who sort of came from a little bit closer to the Dynasty, value center last year, but came on late at the end of the season and looks to be locked into a situation this year, presuming health, which we'll see. It's news this week, but Kenyon Drake, right? I mean, with Kenyon Drake, he's substantially more expensive, right? Because that is that role, I think, is presumed locked in for him, presuming health, where I don't think the same level of comfort exists with Mostert, but I do think he's the most valuable running back. And I think ultimately, if you add it up, I'd peg that to be a top 24 finish.
Yeah, I think for me, the two things I would highlight that you didn't say that would be considerations of this type of deal is number one, I mean, this is a really good return for a guy that came off from the ether. You probably got him for free or almost nothing, if I had to take a guess. And we're talking about a late career. We've had it for a little bit of one season. And this is where I think I wrote an article at one point about Damian Williams and Raheem Mostert, because they're kind of joined at the hip, where it's now way down in their career. They've had their best season, one that they're finally fantasy viable in a big picture sense. Not that, they had one streaming start this time, or they had a good game, but it wasn't predictive at all. They had a touchdown and 5 catches, they were on everybody's bench and he just randomly got some work or whatever. But this is really, so those two, for this point in their career, it's pretty unbelievable. I mean, for Mostert, it's year 5, and he has zero pedigree. And here he comes out of the woodwork. And now it almost feels like that discussion we had from last year with Damian Williams going into the season, where you're like, well, I guess I'm holding now because I couldn't really get what I think I should get in the marketplace. And now you say, well, the upside is so great. But I think 201 for me in a good class, I would take that, just because I would say, if you're in a position that Raheem Mostert is going to make or break you dynasty-wise, because it really is centered on this year, in my opinion. Because 201, you're going to be in a thing that 17 on some names that are far more insulated in the next few years. On a in your 222 model, in the 2-year prism of, you're going to keep them, you're going to have them groomed, and yes, they probably don't produce like Mostert, but I just think big picture. So to me, this is a quality exit for a guy, considering that probably starts on your flex. If you've got some developing other rookies or young players or backup running backs, they certainly could just zoom past in terms of lineup usability for you this year. Last one, Jordan, that I wanted to go over. Another 16-teamer, so this increases the value of one of the players for sure. Hayden Hurst for Alexander Mattison.
I saw Alexander Mattison for N'Keal Harry today, and the Madison owner turned down the trade, which I thought was interesting reminder of how quick things can change in rookie drafts. And
so will you take my 102 for 210 last year? And the person at 210 says no.
No, I'm good. But again, wide receivers maintain value over running backs, right? That's always the interesting thing. I think Hayden Hurst is interesting this year. I think that Alexander Madison's a human hand grenade, right? You can throw him into a week and win it, just because you just throw him in and he destroys everything, right? I mean, that's the level of upside. I think he can do that to a season.
To throw one thing in, Dalvin Cook, because I looked this up earlier today, 48 possible games for Dalvin Cook. He's played 29.
Yeah.
He's coming off the year he actually stayed basically healthy. Do you think are you going to roll for Lucky 7 2 years in a row? So, I mean, there's a very, again, we don't predict injury, but let's just look at the track record dating back to Florida State. I mean, he hasn't had a lot of straight runs here. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and like you said, Madison can change your season. Is Hurst in a 16-teamer, one tight end going to change your season? Probably not, right? The position, plus the fact that scoring at the position, it's not 2 PPR or anything like that. So,
right. I'll say I did see Joe Bryant actually tweeted out today. There was a I forget exactly the form of it, but there was a quote from Schefter looped in there. It might have been a video from might have been an ESPN video, but they were discussing Adam Schefter saying, I wouldn't feel comfortable owning Dalvin Cook in fantasy. And I'll just say there's probably something to that in the contract situation. And, you know, that's one of those things that just I sort of did when I was listening to it. So I would note that that's out there. Again, take with it what you will on that sort of conclusory statement. But I think that that's an interesting tidbit in terms of, I think the upside on Madison's really high in any week that Dalvin Cook doesn't play. And if there's some sort of, we're not getting the traditional holdout because of the new CBA requirements. If there's a in-season holdout of some sort, a disgruntled contract situation, that's something that could also break in Madison's favor pretty quickly. So I'm not entirely sure about what was there, but I just thought that was an interesting note. I mean, and I think if memory serves, if I think they cut off negotiations with him in season, he's going to play out the deal, right? So there's still that upside for it being 2021 a Madison show.
Yeah, and I keep thinking back to, again, the blocked player has many avenues to become unblocked, with James Conner sitting there in Pittsburgh, and it didn't even take a massive injury to Le'Veon Bell to, I mean, and again, this could be Dalvin Cook walks after this year. This could be, my hamstring, tightened up, and instead of, it might be, 2 to 3 games, what if it turns into 6, because he's kind of thinking of next year, or his next contract or whatever. I mean, and now what I would say about these high upside backups this year specifically is now you've got the added question mark of COVID, and that could be a multi-game absence. It could be less of a factor than we are all kind of thinking, or a worst case. But the point is, we don't know, and it's just another branch of the tree of saying these backups, especially the priority ones like Madison, etc. This is the season where you have more avenues, and Cook has more than other ones that don't have any sort of contract issue going on, no perspective of any of these things going on, and a player having full motivation, let's say, I don't know how else to say it, of playing as well as they can for as many games and as many touches as possible this year. There's just a lot of question marks specifically with this, and to me, it's like Fournette and like some of these other players, where if they typically don't stay healthy, I think it's unreasonable to say that, that they're suddenly Frank Gore-like going to put up 5 straight, Marshawn Lynch-like, they're suddenly going to be healthy every single year. Because I'm trying to think back offhand, I can't think if Dalvin Cook played every game one of his years at Florida State. I honestly can't remember that. I know in the NFL, he's missed multiple games every year. So just something to keep in mind there. Final thoughts, Jordan, as we close up here, because we're like 1 week away from week 1 prep. And I would mention that Footballguys, very shortly, we're going to shift from draft prep. There's still a ton out there. Trust me, if you're drafting for redraft or Dynasty, etc., a ton of draft content there. But we are globally as a site going to be shifting to week 1 projections are already up, but a lot of those in-season functions, which I can't wait for, already going to be up by the time we're recording next week.
Yeah, I have one strategic question. Is this a year with COVID and sort of the risk of that you discussed? Is this a year that you'd be more apt to not handcuff your own guys, but find interest in handcuffing other guys? Right, because I think there's a risk of, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this. I think there's a risk of if I own Zeke gets COVID, Tony Pollard also gets COVID, right? I think so. I actually think having your own handcuff this year might be less valuable than it has been in other years. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
We know that positional room would definitely get tested more often for X amount of time. Now, would they be highly now? From everything we've been hearing, seeing, observing, whatever tea leaves we can get, I mean, it sounds like they have been doing an excellent job of even if you're in the same room. I mean, they're masked, they are separated, they're doing the best they can, but you're still closer to them than you are other positions, on the team. The moment you start talking about handcuffs, the first thought I always have is, well, I want the best handcuffs. I don't care do I have the starter or not? Like that part of it is immaterial to me, because I know the philosophy goes like this, and I think it was more of a redraft take that I heard of that if you handcuff your own in a redraft sense, and frankly, a handcuff, we're kind of thinking it within more of a short-term window in Dynasty than a long-term one. But it's that if you have your own handcuff, you're increasing the floor, but you're also decreasing the ceiling, because you can only have one starter at any point in time. And you're going to be guaranteed one, but you can't have two and you can't have zero under that prism. Now, we saw, what was the running back last year where the backup went out?
Madison went on week 16 right. And it was Mike Boone. Yeah,
that's right. But there was another guy earlier in the season. It wasn't Chase Edmonds was one. He had one game and then he got hurt, and that was after David Johnson. But there was another one that he had an opportunity. Was it the Giants? I can't remember. It was the Giants, right? Yeah, Wayne Gallman. Yep. He got hurt the very first game, or he didn't even get that opportunity, or I can't remember what it was. But
he got one game. He was valuable for 36 hours.
Yeah, so you get talking about a tight window there to sell. So you get, and now he's on waiver wires. You get maybe you get that third to second upgrade, but yeah, I think if you have the handcuff, so if I have, say, Dalvin Cook, and then you have Zeke Elliott and I have Pollard, I have the chance of having two high quality starters. Obviously, I could have zero because Zeke is still healthy and Dalvin Cook is out. But again, that upside of two is how you win leagues. You mentioned Latavius Murray, or you get James Conner that other year. All these little micro spans of time that if you can just pummel people, if you get the right role, and if you have the right guys that aren't starting early in the year, but at the end you get, I remember Tim Hightower, that's always a running joke we have, Tim Hightower winning titles a few years ago. But if you have, a couple of spot start guys, what if at the end of the year, you barely make the playoffs, but now all of a sudden you've got one or two guys auto starts, but then you also have, say, what if Darrell Williams is getting a spot start for the Chiefs in week 15, plus you've got Latavius Murray, plus you've got one other guy, Madison or Pollard or whatever. I mean, good luck beating that team if you get there and you got to buy, and now you're rolling into that machinery. I mean, with a couple of flexes, you're starting 4 running backs like that. I mean, so that to me is the upside of having other people's handcuffs. But to me, I mean, I want if I have Zeke, I like Pollard independent of that, or I like Madison independent of how many shares of the starter I have would be, I guess, the final thing to put on it. That's a whole show. We can talk 35 minutes on the handcuffs, and we're almost there, Jordan, where the handcuffs are going to matter. We can start tracking the injury rates, the running back injury rates. All right. So in this episode, we discussed a lot of trading. We talked about deeper formats. We also talked about the thought process behind rankings, which for anyone that hasn't done them, it is involved. It is a labor of love, as we talked about. And there really is no correct way in how to present that to cover all the bases of Dynasty. I would say in redraft, it's a far more transparent, with an end point at the end of the season venture, where Dynasty is more of a, well, what's your team approach? Trading versus on your roster, and all of those factors. And again, next week, we're going to be shifting more and more over the next couple shows to week 1, going into your year, and all of those Dynasty machinations for your teams. I am Chad Parsons. He is Jordan McNamara. And until next time, good luck in your Dynasty leagues.